Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for coming out. My name is Kevin Zhang. I am an investor with GSV Ventures, and I'm thrilled to be with this all-star panel of folks who represent different parts of EdTech, different parts of the world, and so we're thrilled to dive in. I'm going to quickly say a quick sentence on each person just to refresh everyone's memory. I know there's a lot in the app, whatnot, but I realize that probably helpful to get everyone to be on the same page here. We have Ankur, CEO of Teachable, also one of the faces of the creator economy, investor, many things. Sue, she's the Chief Financial Officer of Mathpresso. It is an AI-powered K-12 tutoring app based in Korea. We have Lawrence, co-founder of Get Setup. It is a social learning platform for older adults. And we have Anna, she is the Chief Evangelist for Synthesis School, which is an innovative game-based solution for K-12 learning. They represent different parts of the pre-K to grade spectrum, but one thing they all have in common is that over the past year, they all experienced unprecedented growth as companies, all rocket ships. So certainly going to be fun to uncover some things together today. I'd love to get started with Ankur. It's been a big year, and you really emerged yourself as quite an influencer with all this. What has COVID done for your business, and what's going to happen post-COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. So to set the stage a little bit, Teachable helps people create and sell online classes. And when COVID first hit, it was remarkable because between the week of March 7th and March 15th, 2020, the traffic to our website and all our creators' websites doubled. For context, that was the growth we wanted to have in the next 12 months. So it was, what we found is initially there were a lot of people who intended to launch their business. They wanted to launch their course, but you kept putting it off, and all of a sudden your real business goes away. You have to move to online. So we saw a very, very rapid acceleration. I mean, we grew substantially more than we thought we ever would, ended up more than doubling, year over year, and we're a mature business. Those things were not meant to happen. And it's been interesting now with the world reopening, where what we're seeing is we're no longer growing at the same rates, but the growth we had at that time, it's sustainable. The cohorts are behaving the same, the retention numbers are the same. So our personal experience, and I think it's the same for a lot of other people in the creator and education economy, is your growth eventually will go back to where it was before, but it's on a much, much larger base. So if you can double or triple your business in a year and then go back to whatever, 50, 60%, which is what we're seeing. So yeah, we think this was a complete banner year and has forever changed the world of education.
Right. And Sue, you represent K-12. What's been your experience there?
Sure. So as Kevin said, we are K-12 AI-powered K-12 tutoring app. And our company's vision has always been to use AI to provide personalized education, 24/7 study companion for K-12 students. Now, even before COVID, we were used by over 60 to 70% of target Korean students in Korea, and we were launching into Japan and Vietnam. And instead of COVID, obviously, as students are locked down at their home and have no other alternatives, they were all coming into this digital device for alternative learning. So over the 2020, our monthly active users grew 5 times, but more importantly, our users' daily time spent were doubling or quadrupled in most of the countries that we were operating in. And so not only the new users are coming in, but existing users and new users are all using more. And what's most important is Ankur shared, all of these users, as we are coming out of COVID in some parts of the world, the users are still maintain that increased time spent. So I think from K-12 perspective, the emotional barrier that students might have had towards EdTech, how now have been knocked down that now they tried it during COVID.
I got to play devil's advocate here. I'm an EdTech investor, so I have to be biased. But there's other investors here sometimes who are not EdTech. We're not totally out of COVID yet, right? So there's a world in which in 6 months, 8 months, it goes away. And we've seen some companies just be purely a COVID bump. So what would you say to those investors or those naysayers? Lawrence, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I'd be happy to take that. So for Get Set Up and the 60-plus demographic, obviously COVID played a pretty significant role in how it impacted our demographic. So we're a social learning platform for older adults, and our demographic, quite honestly, might have been more impacted than any other. Suddenly you had older adults who you'd argue were reasonably isolated before the pandemic. Now we're completely isolated and had to learn how to do everything virtually, order medication to their homes, learn how to use telehealth, learn how to book use a Uber app to book a ride to that all-important doctor's appointment. Older adults were incredibly impacted. And so to answer your question, Kevin, I would suggest that there was a huge behavioral change for older adults. COVID helped accelerate that, but they've now discovered the power of the internet and how to use Zoom to open up this whole new universe of other things that they can now use, now learn. And so I think that behavior will continue. I think it's a really big category, and I don't think we go back to sort of the slower growth that we had before.
Right. Anna, your perspective here is certainly unique. You've also been a public figure here, and Synthesis has, I'll let you, explain Synthesis, but I got to imagine COVID's been an interesting year for you in terms of parents being more open to new models that are totally different than what we saw before in K-12. So talk about that and what COVID's meant in that regard.
Yeah, so a little distinction, like during the pandemic, a lot of what families experienced, especially K through 12, was remote learning, which is when you grab what you've been doing in the classroom in the traditional setting and you try to replicate it in the online setting. And this tends to be a low engagement, and most of the time it's not really the effective environment for kids to be learning. So it wasn't such a pleasant experience for many parents. What we were trying to do with Synthesis, and just for a little bit of context, Synthesis came out of Ad Astra, which was the school that our co-founder Josh Dawn and Elon Musk started at SpaceX about 6 years ago. So it was a lab school where they would experiment with different ways of teaching and pushing sort of the boundaries of innovation. And the goal was to teach through a problem-solving approach to kids. So Synthesis was the most popular class at the school, and it was game simulations and game-based challenges to teach kids how to make decisions, how to solve problems, and how to collaborate to sort of make sense of chaos and uncertainty, which is what we faced this past year and a half. And so a lot of what we've done is grab what was happening in that school, like this Synthesis course, and put it into software so that the experience that used to be limited to just the SpaceX students, and it was 50 students at the school, is now available to students all over the world that have access to internet and that can afford what we're currently charging, which I guess is something that you also wanted to talk about.
Right, yeah, so I'd love to unpack that, for you and for the audience. I think I'm convinced that the world's changed forever because of COVID, and that more people are open to learning online and there's behavior change. But the flip side is there's certainly an argument to be made that this has actually just widened the gap between the haves and have-nots, right? So we'd love to hear from you first, and then the group. How do you think about this massive adoption of digital learning in terms of reaching all socioeconomic buckets, and has it widened the gap in many ways, or actually maybe it's actually bridged the gap between the haves and have-nots?
Right. So right now, our goal is to get Synthesis to as many kids all over the world. We sort of see ourselves as using like the Tesla approach, where we're starting by building a really great product, and we're hoping to be very profitable so that then we can actually scale down so that we can reach more kids around the world. There's already an amazing group of people that are working on the lower quartile of the population, and that work is very noble and very important. We, however, are more focused on sort of like raising the ceiling and pushing the boundaries in that sense, like pushing the frontier, so that we can actually come up with something really great that then we can then expand to kids from all over the world.
Yeah, and Ankur, I'd love to hear your perspective too. The creator economy has had so much hype over the past year. How do you think about that challenge, right, of Teachable unlocking and career mobility and serving everyone?
I don't think it increases the gap between haves and have-nots, because really, even though I've lived in America 12 years, it's very easy to think about America as the center of the world. But the real gap between have and have-nots is really people internationally, people from countries who've not had access to knowledge and information. And while, of course, this is not perfect, and there's better people in higher socioeconomic classes have better opportunities, I think we're getting closer. I think now, no matter where you live, you have access to information, and I think that's massive. Like that is, like of all the things to come off it, that's massive. Secondly, like the institutions that we're not fully replacing, but the institutions in place, right? I mean, you look at Ivy League universities, credentialism, blah, blah, blah. Like the past was also not super rosy in terms of the kind of opportunities it made available. So my overall take is net, this is, this is making the gap smaller, but I mean, the gap is still there and we still have to work very, very hard to address that.
And Sue, in Asia, what's been the story there for you?
Yeah, so being based in Korea, we have there's a Korean session later if you're interested, but there's this area called Daechidong, which has the highest real estate price because of the private and public education that are only accessible from that area. So our company was actually built to bring that high quality education to everyone across the globe through AI. So, through COVID, obviously we hit #1 in education chart in over 20 countries, and majority of those countries were low-income countries. And our external advisor actually did a research with our data, saying that the users from low-income countries felt that they improve their math score better than the developed country, which means if there's no other alternatives, then these edtech can be really powerful in making changes in their life. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And Lawrence, for you, when I think of a product like yours, and when I think of elderly who are able to use Zoom and equipped with it, it's not my grandparents. What's been your experience there in terms of?
So we deal a lot with the have-nots, right? Bridging that digital divide is an important part of what we do. And I think part of why we grew so quickly during the pandemic is we went and partnered with the organizations that were serving our older adults, the older demographic, and said, how can we help you? In many cases, this was the health insurance companies, this was the state governments, the local governments, the area agencies for aging. There's one of those in every county. They all had budget to try and sort of help older adults get into initial physical classes to learn things like Zoom and learn things like telehealth. And so when the pandemic hit, all of that was shut down. And so we were able to quickly sort of step in and offer ourselves as an alternative to sort of help bridge that gap and change the sort of have-nots into the haves, right?
I love to build upon what you just said there. I've had great admiration for your company and how you've built community. It's quite remarkable. And there's plenty of companies that we see at GSV who say they build community but don't actually. I'd love to hear your, what role does community play in your company? What did COVID do for that? And how do you see that, what do you see post-COVID life being with community digitally for learning?
Yes, that's a really great question. We started as a tech enablement solution for older adults, because if you don't solve the first mile problem, helping somebody get comfortable with their smart device, iPhone, tablet, iPad, whatever it is they need to get into sort of that first Zoom class, you don't solve that problem, you can't solve the last mile problem. And so we realized that if we did that and we got folks sort of into their first Zoom class, and we completely customized the Zoom tool and made it sort of very senior specific, and a lot of what we added to the tool were things to sort of increase kind of engagement and connection. And the wonderful thing was, once folks sort of were able to overcome that hesitancy around learning something new, because we're older adults teaching other older adults, and that does a lot to sort of disarm sort of that fear and hesitation. They get into that first class, they turn on the camera, you get them comfortable asking a question, and that's a huge milestone. And I say all of that because if you accomplish that, then they start connecting with others in that class, and they come back and they take book club together, they'll take cooking classes together, and then we've created the start of what then becomes a really interesting community. The other thing that helped us grow quite quickly was, if you think about sort of the older adult population, specifically in the US, most of us are first, second, or third generation immigrants in this country. And when we started offering sort of the ability to invite and share, a lot of our older adults were sharing with older friends and family and loved ones, caregivers, in countries around the world. And so we quickly became international. And I don't know why it surprised us, but it did. And so of our sort of over 2 million sort of active monthly users, half of that is now international, just because that's who they shared and invited into the community.
I'd like to add something
Yes,
to
please.
that, which made me think that one of the things that was really important as well, like around engagement and community, during COVID, as you saw earlier, I referenced remote learning and how in this kind of environment, it's really hard to socialize and interact, especially because it's very passive for the students. So many students were social deprived during this time. When we originally started Synthesis, it was mainly the 7 simulations that we had where the kids would engage, the adults, facilitators are barely involved, so the kids are doing most of it. And unlike regular online courses, they're like at the edge of their seats, they're very excited, they're doing a lot of talking, they're meeting kids from different countries, they're in breakout groups. And we started to notice that then after the sessions, the kids would ask if they could hang out with the other kids that they met in the simulations. So we realized that in addition to having this like educational opportunity for kids to learn through games, the mental models and game theory that we were teaching them, it was also an opportunity to expand our product so that we added the community element. So we started a Discord channel, we started we now kids are able to spin their own games with their own friends that they bring. We have tournaments with families, and this really started to create sort of like a network. So it became more than just a game, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that this kind of learning experiences will prevail even after COVID, because we've found something more than just the actual product.
Thank you. I'm really curious to also hear what Ankur says. There was a period of time earlier this year where we were getting pitched a company that was trying to be Teachable of X or Next Teachable every few weeks. And they say, we're going to be Teachable plus community or Teachable plus cohorts. So how do you think about community and where does that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, look, everyone's going to say community is super important to our business, blah, blah, blah. We say the same stuff, but I'll tell you something we got wrong about community early on. Early on, we thought, and you can see this in our first fundraising, we thought we're building a platform for, I don't know, we called it the $1 Million Teacher. So we had this vision that like everyone would learn from the best person to teach something. And pretty early on, we came to a realization that there is no best teacher for anything. One of the things the democratization of teaching allowed for is everyone sort of found the best teacher that was different. Maybe it's because this teacher looks like you and you've not seen other people who look like you do this thing. Maybe it's because you're in an outgroup of some kind. Like a very simple example is the most successful programming course on our platform was taught by 2 kids that are objectively bad at programming and took a long time, but that's relatable, right? Like that's, I want to learn from that. I want to learn from those people. So in that we saw the kind of community, like the democratization of teaching allowed for people to build these like subgroups and sub-communities where, yeah, like different teachers were better for different people. So that was a really, really big observation. In terms of community and courses being together, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's something that, again, we're seeing cohort-based courses, lots of other people doing that, but it's, to my mind, there's no innovation there. Like we've done that forever, right? Like schools have had communities, colleges have had communities. So I still think online education today is in a stage of, I mean, companies like yours are doing cool things, but most of us are still really doing what we did 25 years ago, but behind a computer. And I think the entire industry will kind of move from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from our perspective, because our app is used to teach the children, so if we do some sort of peer-to-peer element, then that defeats the purpose of giving the professionally verified answers. So we have to go with very delicate approach on how we deal with the community. So for us, it was more to increase the motivation from the students. So let them join a study group and then turn on the timer together and then see who's studying and so build that sort of motivational engagement element there. But it's sort of delicate balance that we're trying to build. But the community feature for K-12 students is definitely that increases the stickiness of the app very much.
Yeah, thanks. Switching gears for a second, the unprecedented consumer adoption, you're clearly an example of it. Obviously, hasn't just been a U.S.-focused one; it's been global, and not every part of the world is out of COVID yet, and so I think those bumps are still happening. But everyone here actually has, I think, perspective on different parts of the world and consumer learning there. I'd love to start actually with Lawrence. We'd love to hear your experience with global adoption and help enlighten us. Many of us are probably pretty U.S. focused. Experiences in India or other parts of the world. How does it compare to the U.S.? What are observations you have on consumer learning in other parts of the world compared to the U.S.?
Sure. Initially, we started we launched in the U.S. Most or all of the users were older adults based, in the U.S. When they started inviting and sharing, it spread to interesting parts of the world. India being a significant one, South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia. But India was really quite interesting because it got big for us quickly. And we saw very different use cases there because in the US, we're actually trying to solve sort of a technical gap, like getting that older adult comfortable with whatever smart device they're going to use to get into that first Zoom class. In India, the older adults are very comfortable with their smart devices and they all use WhatsApp. And so we'd have 50 bookings for a Bollywood class. They would share a link and there'd end up being 150 Indian ladies dancing in that class when there was only 50 bookings. And so we realized that WhatsApp was a really interesting technology that was ubiquitous, that really sort of helped sort of class attendance, invites, and virality really spread. That's been true of some of the other markets where there's an underlying tech that the older adults are comfortable with. But in the US, we had to start with sort of solving that kind of digital divide and first helping folks get comfortable with the device, then into the class, and then comfortable in that environment before they'd even share an invite, where in places like India, it went there literally the first class.
Right. And Ankur, I'm curious, your perspective now, having merged with Hotmart, Brazil, Latin America compared to the US, what have been your observations on consumer learning?
By the way, I just want to echo the WhatsApp culture is insane. We ended up merging our business with the company based in Hotmart. So working with Brazil, it's the exact same. People use WhatsApp in place of Slack, in place of email. They take notes by WhatsApping things to themselves. Everything is on WhatsApp. But no, it's been interesting. One of the big motivations behind merging our business is, again, going back to the global thing. We live in a global world, but didn't want to be super US-centric, so merged with a company in Brazil called Hotmart. We're seeing, so we're half ed tech, half creator economy. Something that surprised me, and this is just my own ignorance, is how big, in some cases substantially bigger, the creator economy is elsewhere. Wow. Here we think we have a big creator-driven culture. It is that on steroids in a lot of other markets. I mean, Brazil and India being two notable ones we're pretty familiar with. And as such, things like online courses by creators are further along and at a greater market maturity there. So from a trends perspective, we've seen Brazil grow faster in a lot of ways. India is also growing faster. India still has a bit of an issue where it's harder to get Indian consumers to pay for digital content. So that's something we're still trying to get a little bit further on. But otherwise, it's really cool to see creators be global in that, we have lots of Indian creators selling courses to a US audience. It's still English, right? At a substantially cheaper price point for the US consumer, but from a per capita income perspective, there's a lot of Indian people earning a great living on a few $1,000s a month. And I think that's the part that I'm most encouraged by with global education is, being able to educate people around the world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What are the key drivers of the creator economy and online courses being bigger in Brazil and India?
Social media is huge. We think social media is big here, but social media is massive over there. And it's just, I also think the thing that matters is what the dominant technologies are when people get cell phones and stuff, right? In India, I think 300 or 400 million people got cell phones and internet for the first time in the last couple of years. So that's the internet you grow up with. So as a result, it just led to rapid adoption.
Anna, I'm crazy curious about how you all are thinking about global expansion and what folks have thought about you all globally. As a Chinese American, I'm exposed to a lot of Chinese media, and the obsession over Elon Musk is insane. So just curious what has been, what is Synthesis thinking about with global adoption? How are you received globally? Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so we also have a very big market in India. In fact, we're thinking about next year in 2022 having a CEO just for India, just because our market there is so big. But we really have kids from all over the world. And again, when Synthesis was the physical class at Astra, at the school at SpaceX, the demographic, it was they were all kids from America, right? Once we put this online, it's incredible because now we have kids from Australia, from Brazil, from India, from Colombia. So a whole scope, and they're all ages 8 through 14, and we mix them. And just also for a little bit of context, our simulations are very different from anything kids see in school. We'll basically throw them in. We won't tell them what to do. They have to figure it out. It's very chaotic and uncertain, and they have to switch gears. So they're constantly having to figure it out, very much like the real world. And it's so interesting when you go in the simulations and you go in the breakout groups and you hear the kids, for many of them, it's the first time that they're interacting and trying to solve a problem with a kid from a completely different country. And for many of them, they wouldn't have had that opportunity otherwise, right? Because they're stuck in their schools with people of their neighborhood that look very much like them. So it's really interesting when you start to hear the perspective of a kid in India solving a specific problem. For example, they're like building networks or managing ocean ecosystems or colonizing space or controlling wildfires. But when you bring the perspective of all these kids from different countries, it's unbelievable the kinds of solutions. So it's the first time that we're seeing like kids solving problems in a way that looks very much like the kind of things that they're going to be doing as adults in the real world. So it's really incredible.
Wow. And to close out, Sue, curious to hear your thoughts too. But also, one thing that Korea has certainly experienced a lot of is just the role of the government in this. So really curious to hear about that and maybe even your thoughts on China. But no worries if you don't want to go there.
Let me address our global sort of adoption first. So coming into COVID, we were offered in 4 different languages, but 2 of them we didn't make a major push because we launched it and we let it roll. Over the course of COVID, we launched additional 3 languages, and we were offered we were used in over 150 countries. Now we are in K-12 space, so the seasonality of education is extremely important. So we have to watch the local sort of curriculum, academic calendar to make sure whatever content launch that we're doing suits the local environment. So for example, in Indonesia, students during Ramadan, they don't study. So you should not try to push them to study, right? So there are a lot of these cultural aspects that we needed to watch out for as we do the global sort of push. One thing that COVID really helped was there were so much macro events that were going on that otherwise would have taken us, years to collect. So, for example, school shut down, exam shuffling, major policy change that, normally, education is very conservative sector. It wouldn't happen so much, but it was happening every single week. And all of these countries that we were in, we were able to observe the student behavior as well as their study habits. So imagine if you're teachers from traditional school, there's no way you could understand students' study habit in that depth. So COVID really helped us to understand the students from the global perspective, and we use that to in our new launch effort as well as marketing and content strategy. So that's the global perspective. Coming into your question around the China and Korea regulation, since our app isn't offered in China, I might not be in the best position to talk about it. But Korea did have the regulation on private education back in 2014, 2015. And because private education spend is such a big social problem in Korea. However, this is more cultural thing. Going into good university, getting a good score is inherent desire for a society who compensates for that. So it is more of a role for education technology to make sure that whoever wants that access to have that access instead of trying to block that from altogether. So yeah.
Right. A question occurred to me while you all were talking, and it's a debate that we have a lot at GSV, and I could use some help and some arguments so I can win debates internally with my team. Scott Belsky, who is a chief product officer of Adobe, said that when you think about building products, you have to assume that your consumers are lazy, vain, and selfish. And when I think about that, I guess when I think of a learner, I guess on one hand maybe some are lazy, vain, and selfish, but I do feel like, is EdTech any different? Is there any difference in EdTech around how we need to think about consumers and serving them? Because we are trying to reach probably higher order parts of who they are as people. Would be open up to the group on that.
I don't think so. I mean, we find most of our time like fighting like like we spend most of our time on human psychology and getting people to do things that they know is good for them, but they still just don't do it. So for us, I'll give you like a great example, and I think that this goes back to why community and stuff becomes important, is self-paced courses traditionally have terrible completion rates. I mean, and the cheaper it is, the less people like look at it. It's the same with books, right? Like we see in our data, a lot of people buy courses, are excited a little bit, day one, day two, eventually kind of trail off. This is why cohort-based courses are interesting, because you build in accountability. So I think when you're designing a product, and I think a lot of courses, especially if they're not mandated for some other third-party thing. Like I think colleges and high schools, they have a lot of third-party mandates. I don't think, it's not driven by, trust me, like all the math homework I did, there was no intrinsic motivation. Like it was because I had to do this for some other reason. Lifelong learning is cool because you no longer are doing it for anything but your own intrinsic motivation. But as an educator, I strongly urge everyone to build in accountability, to just build in like catering to the fact that humans will likely put off things that are good for them. So what can we do to design an experience that is rigged to succeed?
Anna, what do you think? I mean, I know there's a gamified approach, but you're really asking kids to do some pretty high-level things. I'm sure it takes a lot of intrinsic motivation. Like, how do you think about?
Yeah, so before joining Synthesis, I was an elementary school teacher for many years. And what you notice is that what we do in schools, in traditional schools, is we water down a lot of the concepts that we teach kids. We sort of assume that we need to make it less, more simple so that they can understand it. And then suddenly at Synthesis, we do it completely different. And it's really, really engaging for the kids. The kids feel like they're playing video games. They ask their parents that they want to join. And the reason is not just because it feels like a game, but because we trust that the kids can actually understand and tackle the complex challenges that we're giving them. So we don't water things down, but rather we create the perfect environment where they can experience all this like mental models that, like you were saying, they're mostly for adults, but we're exposing kids to this and we're noticing that they can tackle this, that they can do it, and that they love the challenge and they love having to figure things out and when things are hard. So we've done a lot of that, but also the engagement component is extremely important. So the students are there because they want to participate in the simulations and they're learning about things that are very applicable to the real world without us having to lecture them on anything, right? It's all through the simulation, and that's very crucial to what we do. And perhaps that's why we have the amount of students that we do.
Interesting. And Lawrence, are the elderly adults you serve, are they lazy, vain, and selfish, or what are they like?
They're very opinionated. Very opinionated. I have a 91-year-old father who emails me every day and tells me what sucks about the website, the classes, the UI, whatever. Like, we get very honest feedback. The complexity for our business is removing the complexity. And so I have a gifted 36-year-old co-founder who knows how to add as many features and functionality to something as I would ever want. But what we realized is that, with our demographic, it's all about suppressing the complexity and surfacing what it is you want them to do, and sequencing all of the other things, suppressing all of the other things so that you don't distract. And so making something simple and easy for us is the complexity. So it's a different answer than I think some of the other folks on the panel.
Right. We've got a few minutes left. I'd love to open up to the audience for a few questions. If anyone has any, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
Great, yeah. I'm Santiago from Hackio. We train via WhatsApp, and we are obsessed in creating the most simple experience of education for blue-collar employees, but we have a little problem, and if you want to create the most simple experience the most simple education experience, maybe your experience is not very significant at the end. So how you can have a good fit between complexity but also the significance of the process? Because if you want maybe a little better test or conversations, anything, this will create a more complex experience.
Yeah, great to see you. The question was balancing simplicity and complexity to deliver real learning, right? Yeah. Go for it.
I think in line with the earlier topic, we get that question a lot because our idea is give the 5-second AI-based solution to students, and it's highly focused on efficiency than anything else. The way we view it is the risk of giving up is just so much higher that 70% of high school students are behind their math curriculum. So if you keep throwing at them the math question that requires 30 minutes thinking, they're gonna give up. I'm not sure if you remember the last time you saw the complex math question, but I would. So instead, if you give them 3 to 5 minutes to solve it, you actually induce their behavior to try. So for us, it's more, it's a complex subject. Some people will cheat, but some people will still study, in the midst of it. So it's balancing the efficiency, but giving the access and giving the tools for them to at least have the means to reach the goal that they want to is something that we want to solve at this point.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a high schooler and a founder of a math education company. Now, I had a question about price setting. Like, what me and my co-founder are kind of struggling with is we don't want to set the price so low, like as you said, the kids aren't that motivated to use it. But we also don't want to set it so high that we limit the amount of students who are able to afford it. So do you have any advice on like setting the right price?
Yeah, so setting the right price is a question, and you're a high schooler starting a company, right? That's awesome. I'd love to talk to you after for sure. Anyone want to take that pricing?
I can share our data at least, but maybe for the math specific stuff you can ask her. So our data has shown that very often charging more is actually, like, even selfishly will make more people actually take a course, because when people set prices too low, people don't take courses. We've typically found most creators on our platform can double their prices, not hurt their conversion rates, increase student satisfaction, and reduce the refund rates, ironically enough. In terms of like tactical numbers, it's very, very hard to share because it depends on where you're comfortable with, but like just having talked to thousands of people, the price is probably twice as much as you're comfortable charging. Like just, having seen everyone, like if you're not a sociopath, chances are the price you want to charge is gonna be less than probably the optimal price. So my advice would be, start with something you're comfortable with, keep adding value, keep improving the product, and then slowly increase the price, and grandfather people in always on the older price, and kind of use that learning to find the sweet spot.
Absolutely. So we've also rolled out our premium version, and even if we double the price, when we do the A/B testing, the actual revenue doesn't change much, but meaning the conversion rate goes lower. So it depends on what's your vision, what you want to do with this company. For us, we want to just help more people, and as doing that, we get student data, and our true vision is to provide personalized education, which relies on getting the personalized data. So even if they're using it for free, we get the data. So that's a careful balance that you want to take. But does that answer your question?
We have a couple minutes left. We'd love to just hear final closing thoughts from you all on EdTech or COVID and EdTech, just any final thoughts.
It's a hard prompt for people not to be. I can go first to give my panelists time to think about their answer.
Thank you.
I think, look, I think we're obviously, like, the world has had a really shitty time in the last year. We're all of us, like, I remember when COVID first happened, like, just reminding our company about how privileged we are in some ways, like, as the world falls apart, that, like, the specific thing we're working on is tending to do okay. With that, we honestly felt a certain amount of guilt and whatever. But coming out of where things are now, I think EdTech is finally being taken seriously. I think for a long time it did not deliver the outcomes that people quite expected it to. I think the emergence of the creator economy, in turn, combined with EdTech, is a really, really exciting development. And I'm glad that, like, more of our, like, brighter minds are now working towards these problems. And I'm like super excited by seeing the energy and enthusiasm here, and I hope more people sort of really come to this field.
Yeah, I would say that we all know all the negative things that have happened this past year and a half, but if we think about, like, sort of like the silver lining, and I'm thinking, again, from an elementary school teacher's perspective that saw a lot of things inside the school system, and then now starting to see the awesome things that are possible with online education and with technology, it's a great moment to finally reinvent the way that we do teaching and learning and start to rethink things like feedback. How do you give feedback, or assessment, or the kinds of incentives that we have for learning when we were talking about how do we turn kids or adults into lifelong learners. We're in a very unique place right now where we can start to use technology to optimize for these things and to actually like create the learning environments for this virtual audience and to make teaching and learning better. So.
Sue?
And as much as COVID has affected sort of the older adult population, I think it has sort of intensified sort of the analysis and the community at large as a demographic where we need to think more about how we serve them. There's more startups thinking about this category. I would argue that it's the fastest growing portion of the population, probably the most underserved. I think the venture community is funding more businesses in this space. So I think that, you know, if some good has come from sort of COVID, in our category, it's making a lot more people think about how to solve the problems there.
Bring us home, Sue.
Oh, okay. So we're over time, but what we learned during COVID was also the timeshare that the majority of the students' timeshare used to be occupied by human being. But now through COVID, there's evidence that all these AI-powered or automatic tools could take more portion of that time. So I think it's an exciting time for us to be here, and all of us trying to bring that equity in education. I feel very excited to be in this space. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.